In this presentation, we will be exploring the standards related to forward counting and to skip counting, with a particular emphasis on instructional ideas and sequencing. In kindergarten, children's arithmetic strategies are primarily based on acting out situations, counting everything by ones, physically representing all of the quantities. But in first grade, there's an emphasis on moving them into more advanced strategies, and the first of those more advanced strategies on the horizon is counting on. Now, in order to count on in first grade, which includes actually counting on during a counting task, where they're really counting things, in order for them to use that as a tool while counting objects, their rote count must already be mastered. So that means that in kindergarten they need to learn to do a rote count starting from a number other than 1, so that they will be ready in the fall of the kindergarten year to move forward on shifting out of that into some more advanced strategies. So it's really important to get students to this point before the end of the school year in kindergarten, being able to count forward starting from a number other than 1. Earlier, we discussed the developmental considerations that children's rote count of the number word list should be considerably ahead of what they were being able to count with concrete objects. So maybe I can do a rote count to 100, but I'm actually, in terms of counting concrete objects, working with quantities 25 and less. That's normal. Developmentally, that's very appropriate. That's also true here. We're not going to have students starting at a number and moving forward in their count way up on the upper range of that oral number word list. Rather, we are going to have them do this with the portion of the number word list that's really, really solid. So maybe I can rote count by ones to 100, but in terms of counting forward from a given number, I might start counting forward from 8 and go to 17 or something like that, where it's much more within that range that's more solid. Most of the forward counting that you do in kindergarten will actually likely be within the 3 to 20 range, and this is something that is your end goal, so it's very possible in your curriculum, and it depends a little bit on the students that you're working with, but very likely this particular goal will be for the spring of the kindergarten year rather than, say, the fall or even mid-year. Similar to our discussion of learning other counting sequences, children benefit by many small but frequent learning opportunities related to this. And that includes rote counting and then relating the counting to actual objects. So we're going to take a look at what some of those small but frequent activities could be, and also how to help students see the application aspect of this skill set. In the beginning, we need to acknowledge the difficulty, the very real difficulty, in starting from a number other than 1, and offer some scaffolds to help facilitate that process. Now, in the fashion of true scaffolds, they are not a crutch because they are temporary. At some point, they should be able to be pulled back, and the child doesn't need them anymore. They're able to move forward with that anyway. Now, I've included several ideas for forward counting warm-ups here, and I look forward to hearing any ideas that you have in the discussion forum. These are all scaffolded things that you can start with, things that provide some initial support. Pass the baton involves passing along an object, and whoever has the object continues the count from where you left off. So in this way, you can start it off. The teacher can be holding an object and say 4, 5, 6, hand it to the next person who goes 7, 8, 9, pass it to the next person, so on and so forth. And you can have, before you do this, a target number that should be the stop value, and then at that point they can start over and a new person can take over. Children can forward count from a given number while a student or teacher points at a number path. You see a number path here, and that allows the students to see the numbers that came before and the numbers that came after. So with a pointer, a person can point at the number 4 and say 4, and then the class can pick up after that as they're pointing, go 5, 6, 7, 8. So you can do some techniques like this. Sometimes we have children whisper count till we get to our start number. So if our start number is 4, we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can do that initially. We'll eventually want to scale that back. And then there's also some kinesthetic counting where you just make a body motion to symbolize each of the counts and then start counting on, let's say, the third body motion. So let's say that we are actually going to put our knee to our elbow, and we're going to do it 2 times silent and start counting on the third one, and then we'll count 3. So we do it once, twice, 3, 4, 5. So there's some things that you can do. In this case, you did it 2 times previously, so there's that conception of what it means that you're starting with the number of 3. Now, most of these you have to model before the students pick up on what is the intent of the topic, but you do it at many points in time. To do one of these things should be something that you can do really fast. There's all kinds of downtimes in the middle of the day, transitions where you're going to line up. You do something really quickly. Okay, now we're ready to line up. When students seem much more comfortable with the idea of forward counting, it is time to then gradually remove the scaffolds. And this can involve prompting the children to just close your eyes and imagine the visual number path in front of you. We don't actually have it here today, so you have to use your imagination. Or you can prompt them to make their whisper counting silent, but their mouths can move. And then eventually you can say, okay, we're going to make it super mysterious. People can't even see your mouths move now. That's how silent and quiet you are. They don't even know that you're counting in your head. So you can make it kind of fun, but gradually remove those scaffolds. Learning the forward counting sequences then can also support children with learning tasks such as these and give them an opportunity to practice that. Here they're trying to find the missing number in a sequence. And these images show 2 different units of study which illustrate how you can incorporate this forward counting with whatever you're already learning with your main units of study. So here we have a numbers to 30 activity where they're finding some missing numbers, and the other one is actually a calendar activity in a unit on time, and they're finding the missing numbers on the calendar. So I also said it's good for children to see where the relevance of this skill is, that it's not just a counting game or for fun, but you can actually use it. This is an example of something that you can do with the whole class to get them ready to see that transference. And although not all of your learners are going to be ready to do this, it is a first grade expectation. You will have students who are clearly quite ready to be counting on and to use that during counting tasks. And you maybe have some others who could be there with a few examples and modeling. So it's good to model a counting on task and to encourage students who think they can do this on their own to give it a try. But if this is something you still don't feel comfortable yet, it's all right for you to count by ones. Or maybe you want to try this and then count by ones to double check your work. Okay, so have a given number of counters in a cup and have the cup labeled so that everybody knows how many are inside and they can see how many you put in. Then you can have a few other counters nearby and you can model how you can use the forward counting practice. So perhaps putting your hand on top of the cup and going 6 and then pointing 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So those are some kinds of things. Actually, it's 12. There's 6 there. So those are some things that you can do to help model it. You can do that a few times. Have the students help you the next time with doing a choral count where they're counting with you as you do the count. And then during the counting activity for the day, some of the students will potentially be able to do that for themselves. Actually, quite a few students may pick up on this, but it will just be interesting to see what your students do with some modeling. Forward counting was a step up in difficulty because children had to think of all the numbers that came before in one big group. Earlier, we called this idea nested numbers, recognizing that the number 6, for example, included all the previous numbers as well, and then leveraging that idea to make counting more efficient. So that's the challenge of forward counting. But the challenge embedded in forward counting is taken even further when we get to skip counting, because in this case, we have to navigate the number system in equal-sized groups. The only skip counting requirement that's specifically stated in the Common Core standards is counting by tens, although counting by 2s and 5s is also advisable because quantities of 2 and 5 are more easily seen at a glance. I can look at 2 and just know it's 2 without going 1, 2. Similarly, many children can also subbatize 5. So those are quantities that are very manageable. And so those are good quantities to start skip counting with. The skip counting by fives also has another advantage in that 2 5s make a 10, and so thinking of 10 as 2 5s and being able to skip count by fives could potentially support them in terms of place value, and multiplication is another practical example of skip counting. So starting that here can have some benefits down the road. Children can be taught to skip count by rote through counting exercises similar to the ones we learned about earlier in this PD module. However, it is also wise to try to link this type of skip counting with some visual images to foster meaning for the skip counting. Now, I was working with a little first grade girl a few years ago, and I was doing an activity that you may have seen before where I had her draw as many stars as she could in 1 minute and then count them. So she counted them by ones, and then I asked her if she could count them in any other ways. So she pointed at each star one by one, but she said her verbal count was 10, 20, 30. So she was pointing to one star and calling it 10. So clearly she had the rote skip count down pat, but she did not have any context or understanding of conditions in which that rote count would be considered appropriate. And for this reason, I think it's really important to include some visual opportunities for students to see some advantages of rote counting. So they're not just learning a rote counting technique, but also thinking about where they could apply it. So you can use a variety of images to help build the idea of skip counting in real context. How should we count these? What makes sense for this arrangement? Look at the leaves example above. We can actually count the first branch to make sure that it has 10 leaves, and then we can point to the second one and say, oh, this looks exactly the same. Do we have to count this, or do we know how many it is already? Okay, so if we know this is 10 and this is 10, what can we count by? What have we been learning in our rote counts that would help us here? So that's something. Some students who don't want to rote count by tens, they may suggest rote counting by fives because there's 5 leaves on one side and 5 on another. So you could go 5, 10, 15, 20. That would also be acceptable. So being able to see that there's more than one way to count, but to try to take advantage of the structure of the objects that we're counting. This would be very advantageous, and looking at structure and making use of it is also one of the mathematical standards of practice. Now, we're clearly talking about a skill that grows over time. So when you introduce these counting things initially, you're not going to necessarily see students saying, oh, yes, you could count it by tens or count it by fives, and then you have to do this. I mean, it takes time. We're going to be seeing a video this week called Counting Collections, and you can see that the students didn't arrive at where they are in this video overnight. You can see that this teacher is reaping the benefits of having a counting enriched curriculum, and having her students really do some pretty amazing kindergarten math as a result of that. Showing children then these kinds of arrangements and asking them how to consider strategies for counting is also a wonderful warm-up activity, and it can place children in this critical thinking mode where they have to notice structure. So let's take a look at the blue soldiers, for example. Some students might say, well, there's 5 on the top and 5 on the bottom, so I can count by fives, 5, 10. But another student may look at columns and say there's 2 in each column, so I could go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And some students might say, you know, I really didn't count at all. I just noticed that this arrangement's exactly like a 10 frame that we've been working with. So I just looked at it and said, that's 10. That's a 10. Now, these kinds of dialogues get at the meat of standard of practice 7, mathematical standard of practice 7, looking for and making use of structure. And so those are some very advantageous kinds of warm-ups. The red soldiers, when I look at it, I think of counting by twos, although some students might say that there's pairs and there's 5 that are in the front and 5 are in the back. They might choose to do that. What we've talked about so far are ways to make skip counting meaningful by tying it to practice. However, we do also need to get that rote skip counting more fluent. And this is where we can use similar strategies to the ones that we used for the number word list and getting that more fluent. Children love kinesthetic rote practice, and also kindergarten children often need to get up and move. So if you ever need to give your students just a movement break, like okay, we did this and we're getting ready to do that, but I think these students need to move, tie it to a counting exercise, such as one of the ones listed here. The first one is done so simply that you can easily have a visual, and that's a finger flash. So if I flash all of my fingers, that's 10 fingers, and I can pull them back into my fist and then do it again, and I can count by tens that way, and that way we have a visual 10 fingers. Second set of 10 fingers is 20. A third set of 10 fingers is 30, so on. So you can do a finger flash, elbow to opposite knee on each count is kind of like an exercise, and yet they can also be counting. And then sort of Macarena-like skip counting. I've done Macarena-like skip counting by twos with children. I'm not sure if I have the Macarena exactly down pat, but I pat in opposite thighs first and go 2, 4, then opposite shoulders, 6, 8, and then I tap myself on the top of the head for 10. And if you repeat that over and over, then all of your skip counting by tens end up with a pat on the head. So they have a slightly different pattern there. So kids, they love these kind of kinesthetic counting exercises. So and they're so fast, you can do them so quickly that I strongly encourage you to build counting practice through some of these very, very short, 1 minute or less kinds of kinesthetic activities. These counting exercises can be done multiple times a day, the ones I've been talking about, for 1 to 2 minute intervals. And then here you see a sample sequence for how the nature of the counting activity can actually transform over the course of a school year. So they start at the beginning of the year counting by ones to small target numbers. By the end of the year, your students should be able to rote count to 100 by ones and by tens. They can also forward count by the end of the year, starting at any given number up to 30. They can skip count by twos and fives up to 20 or 30. And if your students can do all that and you still have time at the end of the school year, get some backward counting in there as well with those counting sequences. The rote counting exercises are very short, as we've said, so they can be done at these transition points during the day. Counting collections, which we've talked about at previous times during the PD module, it is an essential practice which naturally brings in counting by ones, and there's also opportunities based on what you have them counting for some forward counting and skip counting. And these counting collection activities are critical for grounding it in context. So the counting by ones, forward counting, and skip counting all have these real things that we've been counting. Forward counting, you can give them a container that's perhaps sealed, but it has the number that's inside plus some other ones, and then they have to count forward from that amount. The skip counting, you can give them sets of objects. So if you can have sets of objects that come in twos, fives, or tens, then they can count them as sets or as groups. Now, the counting collection activities take longer, of more class time than those little counting exercises that we talked about, but they are well worth making time for. The activities that you do can allow for considerable differentiation, since different groups of children are working with different quantities and or different arrangements of quantities. And some children can be challenged by counting very large numbers of small objects that are fiddly, so they have to figure out how to organize them so they won't lose their count. Others can be challenged by doing some things that require skip counting or having that sealed box like I told you and some extras. Some may have to count groups and leftover items, which will require them to do some transition skip counting where they skip count by tens and then have to transition to skip counting by ones. The work that they do with this straightforward task promotes foundational understandings of quantity and our number system. And you can pull in parents to support with this by actually having them send collections from home. So you can ask them to send in baggies anywhere from 20 to 120 items of the same type. So that your students can have things to inventory, and they can send paper clips or marbles or whatever. But that will allow for a lot of different collections for your students to count. The images in this video were taken from the Early Bird Kindergarten Mathematics Textbook B.